Hey everybody, welcome back. It's another episode of the Nonprofit Show. And this is a topic I've been really anxious to have on the Nonprofit Show. We're going to be talking about unlocking generosity with behavioral science. And what is it that makes a donor tick? We have two great I'm going to call you social scientists. Is that appropriate?
Sure.
Eleni Fisher and Julia Toffoli are, it's a really cool thing that we can have this conversation and that we can get, some of the emotions out of it and really some of the data behind what's going on. And I think this is going to be just a riveting conversation for so many of us in our sector. We are so delighted to have the support of our sponsors that allow us to have these conversations. And they include folks like Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. And wow, I have two great minds from Ideas 42 that have been a part of some amazing research. Eleni Fisher, she's an associate managing director at Ideas 42, and Julia Toffoli. Did I say that? Toffoli, right?
Yes.
Okay. One Julia to another. You got to hold me accountable. Also an associate managing director at Ideas 42. Both of you understand, I'm sure, more than anyone else, how emotional and how psychological the whole prospect of generosity is. And yet in our sector, we don't seem to know enough about it. We just kind of know it's there. And so that's why I'm so fascinated that you've invested time and energy into this scientific study. So talk to us about Ideas 42 and the origin story. I love the message behind Ideas 42.
Sure. Thanks, Julia, so much for having us on. We're really excited to be here. A little bit about where Ideas 42 came from. Way back in 2008, a group of social scientists at Harvard University started a lab there that was part of the school. They saw a lot of promise in this opportunity to use insights from psychology and economics and data science to create solutions for social change. And then a few years later, in 2010, that lab became what's known today as Ideas 42, a separate nonprofit entity. And we were the first standalone applied behavioral science nonprofit in the United States. And we've grown in the last 16 years or so to become a team that works globally and across a number of different issue areas or domains. So in addition to this work in charitable giving, we work in other spaces like health and education and civic engagement.
Right. It's fascinating. I mean, if you go on to the Ideas 42 website and look across the sectors and what you're doing, they seem like they're very standalone, and yet you can see how they intertwine. I mean, it's a natural flow of knowledge, and I'm excited that you're doing this work because I feel like where you learn in one pillar, you can pull that across to those other pillars. It's fascinating work. Julia, you have been a part of this team and this amazing research. Do you know where that number 42 comes from?
Yes, it is a little bit of an Easter egg. Some people might recognize it right away. 42 is a bit of a hat tip to a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I read the book many years ago, so please don't fact check me on this summary. But essentially, there is a robot machine that says 42 is the answer to the meaning of life. One sort of deep cut fun fact that I learned more recently is that 42 is actually the numerical code for the asterisk symbol. And the asterisk in coding means anything that you want it to be. So that's a sort of second layer of the meaning, is that the meaning of life is anything that you want it to be.
I love that. I mean, that's like perfect for the nonprofit sector too, because we're always searching, right? We're always looking for, what this means. So let's level set our conversation and have you kind of explain to us what behavioral science is, and more importantly, why should we care about it in relationship to generosity? Because I feel like we don't always see these two things being put together.
Definitely. So behavioral science is a study of how humans actually behave, how we make decisions, and not how we assume people should make decisions or even how people would like to make the decisions themselves.
Yeah.
So behavioral science draws on a lot of different kind of realms of academia, psychology, economics, neuroscience, and more. And all of that together tells us that our behavior as humans is really shaped by our context around us and our habits and our emotion, as much as it is by the information that we are absorbing and what our intentions are. So when we see people kind of acting in a way that we are surprised by or we think they shouldn't, it's not necessarily because people are acting irrationally. They're probably using mental shortcuts, and using the biases and heuristics that they have in their minds to navigate the world. And often these shortcuts can serve us well, but in some contexts, they can lead to gaps between our intention and our action. So thinking about giving, I think most people would agree that being charitable is something that is desirable, but there are a number of things about our context that can keep us from actually fulfilling our intentions around giving. And so, for example, like there aren't a lot of social norms around giving. People don't talk about it all that much. I'll let Julia get into a little bit more detail about that. But just one touch high on this, Ideas 42 really uses those findings about behavioral science and how our context can affect our behavior to design products and tools and services for people to follow through on intentions that they have and want to fulfill.
Okay, so this is riveting to me because when I think about science, I think about a journey where we create foundational truths and passages of knowledge, and then we just build on them. I think everyone can agree we're living in a time of phenomenal change. So if we've got all this change going on, that's got to make this discipline even more important and probably even harder to manage, right, Julia? Because if we're looking at like the inputs and the changes of society, holy moly, that's kind of hard.
I mean, a lot of like what Eleni was talking about is our brains were essentially designed to be evolutionarily adaptive. And so, these shortcuts that she mentioned, they're very well designed to keep us alive, but they're not necessarily that well designed to help us make decisions in a space that's increasingly complex. So if you think about, generosity from 50 years ago, maybe you were receiving something in the mail once or twice a week. Now you're maybe getting, I don't know how many text messages, pop-ups, emails, phone badges, et cetera, et cetera. And so the context in which we're making decisions, whether they are decisions about what to eat, whether to go to the gym or not, what to give to, what movie to watch, our brains are just totally overwhelmed. And so it's even more important today to design a context that helps people follow through on those intentions that they have.
Wow. And that's a fascinating way to think about this because I think in the nonprofit sector, a lot of times we've fallen back on what's the emotional hook, what's the emotional story, and we kind of leave it at that, and that we hope that mail in or that email or whatever, that billboard, that personal witness is going to do it for us. But unlocking generosity is a lot more complex, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Very much so. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit more about your study and what you have found in this behavioral science when we think about charitable giving, because it's really different. And I've got to ask too, is this just for the North American population, or would you find that this works across the globe?
Well, okay, we'll talk a little bit about what we found in our research, especially barriers and strategies for overcoming those barriers in a moment. I think I'll start a little bit by talking about how we work, because I think that might answer some questions. Ideas 42 is a global organization, so we do work internationally. our giving work historically has been mostly US focused just because of where we started, but we're starting to look a little bit more at the international space as well. And, you know, brains, oh, I wish I had an hour to talk about this. Brains are brains wherever you are, but they are also shaped by our environments. And so, you know, whether it's a social norm that's extremely culturally dependent, or whether it's even, you know, the patterns that your brain has become accustomed to over time, there definitely are geographic differences in sort of how people react to things. But in terms of our work in giving and behavior, so we've been working in this space since 2016, so about a decade now. And so initially we were really exploring for the first time that intersection of psychology and generosity, right? Really understanding what is in this space, because there wasn't a lot of research here. So early research on that really looked at something like understanding the warm glow, which is that positive feeling that you get when you make a donation or you do something pro-social. So thinking about like, how long does a warm glow last? Can you reactivate it after the fact, right? What does it mean? Is it necessary? So looking at sort of those questions. And really the aim of our work initially was to look at how to increase generosity and make generosity maybe a little bit more strategic or intentional among everyday donors, you know, so people who are giving, retail donors as it were. That was really the beginning of our work. Over the last, let's say, 5 or so years, we've expanded that portfolio to look also at design solutions for high net wealth donors and ultra high net wealth donors. So there's a totally different psychology there in some cases. And then relatedly, just because we have so many partnerships across the giving space, we've also started working to support nonprofits and institutional philanthropy as well. So what does that all mean in practice, right? So we work with various partners across the giving space, whether it's an online giving platform, a donor advised fund, it could be another giving intermediary. And we are essentially working with anybody who's designing for the donor experience in some way. And our goal is to help our partners make giving easier and more rewarding for their donors. So, for example, we worked with a platform to help them redesign their checkout flow on gifts to make it easier for donors to think about supporting the platform itself as a nonprofit, not just the organizations to which they were making gifts. And that's a sort of a great example of just showing how it's really about helping people follow through on their intentions, right? We don't want to try to manufacture intent or get people to do something that they don't want to do. That's marketing.
Sure. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I've got to ask this like follow-up question. The nonprofit thought leaders that you're working with, have they ever considered these issues, or is it just that they know there's something out there, but they don't know how to discover it? Or, you know, like, how do you bridge your work to what the sector needs and try and bring those two together?
Well, I think a lot of people in this space are doing behavioral science somewhat intuitively, especially fundraisers. They just may not necessarily have the framework or the research behind it. And so often when we're sharing our insights with people, it's more of an aha moment where they realize that something they've understood intuitively finally makes sense and they understand why. We're often not giving somebody completely new information that is blowing their mind. We're helping them understand what they already do in a context that maybe helps them deepen it or make it a little bit more effective, or helping them learn how to follow through on, you know, different experimentation approaches to changing what the donor experience might look like.
Yeah. Eleni, that's an interesting thing, because I find in the nonprofit space, it's really hard a lot of times to get those people working in fundraising and development to communicate to marketing and communications and the board and the C-suite. Like what you said, Julia, is so powerful. It's natural and it's kind of instinctual for them, but then they don't always have the tools just to communicate what it is they need or why they need it.
Absolutely. And we've found over the years working with a lot of different online giving platforms that the projects that we do with them really do involve bringing in people from a lot of different verticals within the organization. So like the tech side and the marketing side and the people that are interacting with the donors, and everyone is bringing like their own expertise and their own perspective and lens on it. ultimately everyone has the same goal of encouraging giving, but does take sometimes a little bit of conversation and collaboration together to all kind of get fully aligned on what are we trying to do with this design project, and how are we going to execute it in a way that aligns with our mission as an organization and our branding and our design and all of that. So it's always a process.
It's really interesting because it's such a heavy lift. I know that there's like a big bias, and it's so prevalent in the nonprofit space where board members will just be like, come on, you people in development and fundraising, just make more phone calls, like that's going to solve, and that's going to be a sustainable fundraising. And it's so interesting to hear the two of you speak and to realize we can use different vocabulary and different strategy that ultimately it's going to be a lot better for our organizations, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about strategies in a minute, but I think what's important is that phone calls are great. They're just not the only tool, right? And so a lot of the times our framework is about helping people see what they might have missed, because there's a lot of confirmation bias in our work, and even ourselves, right? We talk about, what are we not seeing here? And the thing that's interesting too about in my former life, I worked as a strategist for a foundation, actually. And I used to say that strategy is kind of like spray paint, and that it takes the form of whatever you put it on. And behavioral science is the same thing, right? We'll find ourselves, like what Eleni was saying, designing a behaviorally informed intervention, but then getting in, and you can design the best tool or test, and if nobody sees it, it doesn't matter. So then you have to get it in front of the right eyeballs, and that is going to involve the marketing team or whatever, comms team. And that marketing push is also a behavioral effort, right? And so the B side doesn't end with the product. It's really something that applies to every single facet of what we do.
Yeah. I've got to believe that you must be spending a lot of time with clients and on projects just on basic education, trying to explain, and even how we started the nonprofit show today, kind of level setting, like, okay, what is it that we do so that we can build trust, and we can understand that this is like a serious investment that we all need to make mentally, financially, all resources, right, to get to where we want to go. I mean, do you see that?
Yes, and that's one of our goals is for any partnership we have to build that foundation with the partners so that they feel equipped after our work together is over, so that they can design and experiment with things on their own without us. I mean, we're always there to be a sounding board or a collaborator, but we've heard from a lot of the platforms that we've worked with over the years that they've taken what they learned from our collaboration and tried something else after, or shared about it with other organizations that they work with. And so we love seeing the behavioral design kind of multiply across the sector over the years too.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. So you've done all this exhaustive research, and you've been in the field and navigating a lot of social change, technological changes that are going about. I would argue political and civic discourse. What did you find are some of those common barriers, and dare I say the new approaches that as fundraisers we should be looking at? And I don't want to just say fundraisers, I'd say nonprofit leaders, right? Like how do we rethink this?
Yeah. I'll talk about a few barriers and quickly, and then Julia, I'll turn it to you to talk about some of the new approaches that we're suggesting. I mentioned before, social norms is a barrier that's pretty common in giving. Most people aren't talking about giving or really thinking about it on a daily basis, or how much they should be giving, or where. It's not really just like something that's a common topic. So that's a really big one. People that are giving don't get a lot of feedback about their gifts in terms of like the number of organizations they've given to, or the amount over the course of the year. It's hard to keep track of those things on your own. A lot of donors don't have like a centralized place where they're following along to know how much they've given or what the impact is. Yeah. Another big problem, a big barrier, is choice overload. There are almost 2 million registered nonprofits in the US. So, and on top of that, there's mutual aid, there's GoFundMe, there's fiscally sponsored organizations. There's a lot of ways to be generous. And it's a lot of work to narrow down, even if you have a neighborhood or a city or a cause that you care about, it's really hard to narrow it down and learn about the organizations you want and make decisions between them. And that can lead people to not make a decision at all or feel less satisfied with the decision that they do make because they feel like, oh, I just got to pick one of these 20 organizations and be done with it, right? So that's another big challenge that we hear about a lot from donors. And then another thing that we hear about a lot and talk about a lot with nonprofits and with donors too is this difference between transactional and transformative giving. Giving really feel transactional sometimes and impersonal, and donors sometimes just it feels kind of extractive, right? And they don't get to feel like they're really making a difference. On the flip side, nonprofits also their time is scarce, their resources are very limited, so finding the balance between donors getting the information and the opportunities that they want and need in a way that is not too taxing for the nonprofit is a tension that we hear about a lot and have been trying to work with different partners in the field on.
Yeah, it's such a basic concept. I mean, it's like kind of the manners that your mother taught you, right? I mean, and yet it seems like such a heavy lift when to me it seems like such a basic thing. So I appreciate you bringing that up because it's easy to lose sight of that, right? It's especially with the digital giving platforms where you're not opening physically a check or seeing someone's handwriting. It's just kind of, ticking through an account. Julia, so we've bemoaned the fact that things are changing and we have all these different attitudes. How do we unlock new approaches? Like, how should we be thinking about this?
Well, that's a great question, Julia. It's almost like we just recently published something that might be of interest to your audience. So we've actually just released a new design catalog. It's called Generosity by Design, which is essentially a summary or a collection of a lot of the insights that we've gained from working in this space for 10 years across all of our different partnerships. So whether you are a nonprofit leader, a DAF manager, a giving platform staff person, if you work at a fund, you run a giving circle, this is good, applicable for you. Essentially, anybody who's touching the donor experience in some way can learn something from this. And we've organized it into these 4 guides or sections that really cover a number of behavioral strategies to engage donors across their giving journey. So it starts with this idea of, a donor can't give if they don't know about you, right? If they haven't discovered you, they don't know, how are they going to give you money? And so capturing attention and sparking discovery is such an important first step for donors. And so the guide explores how you can, again, capture donors' limited attention. Limited attention is also a big barrier that we see. People just don't have time in this attention economy, especially. And how can you help them discover new effective organizations, local organizations, something that is important to them or relevant to their interests, but without making it feel like a chore for donors and without making it feel like a burden to nonprofits. Then once you've captured this attention, we talk about curation and personalization, right? So Eleni talked about choice overload. How do you make that enormous list of possibility and kind of narrow it down to this attractive curated set? And even more, how can you personalize it for donors specifically, whether it's them individually as a person? Technology is making that more and more possible these days. But also maybe for donors in a geography or donors, who have given to an issue area before. So that's really about making it easy to find within a set of organizations one that's meaningful to a donor and that resonates with their interests and their values. Another set of strategies that we talk about in this guide is framing and choice architecture. So how do you examine the way that information and options are organized? How do you influence decisions based on what story you tell, how you organize that space, whether it's, digitally on a website, a binder that you put in front of a client. And, we found that the way that choices are organized and presented can actually make people feel more confident in their decision and more satisfied with their decision, even if they end up choosing the same thing that they might have otherwise, right? So design in this context is really critical. And finally, reflection and feedback, right? So Eleni talked about a lack of feedback being a big barrier. So we talk about how do you shape norms around creating opportunities for learning and feedback, whether it's self-reflection. So can I find a way to look at what I've done or to reflect on my own values as a donor? Or if you have the opportunity to do so, give a donor feedback directly. So maybe you work at a community foundation and you want to find a way to help your donor clients sort of learn alongside each other. They could make that more rewarding as well. So it's a very rich guide. We have, it's almost 20 pages, chock full of strategies and all sorts of things. And we're also very happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk about how to apply those strategies in their own context.
I think it's more than 20. Well, I think
maybe might be more.
I think it's like 22 pages, but it's riveting. It's riveting information that, frankly, I can't believe it's accessible without a paywall. It's really powerful, and I have to applaud the two of you. I think that the title of the report is Generosity by Design. And as I was reading through it, I'm like, this is a design issue. This is a strategic approach that no matter the size of your organization, you can lean into some part of this. I thought it was very achievable.
Yeah. I mean, everything is a design choice, right? At some point, things can happen by default, essentially by the way the system just works, or you can make things happen by design, and nothing really happens by accident. So
yeah, well, I felt like it was more empowering, right? Like you're empowering the process, yourself, your team, and then at the same time, you're empowering the donor. I loved what you said about the donor having more confidence, keeping that glow, feeling better about this. With the 1.9 million registered nonprofits in this country, there's a hell of a lot of choice. I mean, so yeah, I think it's a really amazing tool, and I'm just thrilled that the two of you would come on to the nonprofit show and talk to us about this. I feel as though an organization that really digs into this report and starts to open up their mind in a different way might really set themselves up for some unexpected success. And Julia, to your point, it's not magical. It's pretty much a choice, right? It's a strategy. And so Kevin, our executive producer, just put up a QR code. And if you access that will take you right. Thank you, Kevin. That'll take you right to the report, because it's absolutely fascinating. And we are so honored that both of you would come on and share your knowledge with us. Eleni Fisher, she's the Associate Managing Director of Ideas 42. Julia Toffoli. Toffoli, close?
Sure.
Toffoli. Say your last name again.
Toffoli. Like toffee.
No, I just dug it in my head and it went right out. Toffoli. She's also an Associate Managing Director at Ideas 42. Really interesting work. Thank you so much for doing this for our sector. Really eye-opening, even for somebody like me who thinks, I've heard all of this before. I learned some new things that really kind of navigated me into maybe reframing some of these old stereotypes that I had going on when it comes to generosity and fundraising. Check this document out. It's really, really important for any size of nonprofit. We have amazing partners here that allow us to have this conversation. We're almost coming up on our 1,600th episode, and that's because of these amazing partners that we have. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that are with us day in and day out. All right, I can't wait to see what the next big thing that the two of you get on. This is very exciting stuff.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, and you know where to find me. So when you have more information, I'm inviting you back on because it's just riveting work, and we are grateful that you're applying your knowledge and your expertise to our sector. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Hey, as we end each and every episode of the Nonprofit Show, we leave with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.